So first we have my co-organizer, Aika Rots, who's tuning in from Oslo. Hello, Aika. Aika is an associate professor at the University of Oslo. He's written extensively on the topic of Shinto, forest management. He also works on Vietnam, heritage making, Japan making, and he is the principal investigator of an ERC starting grant called Whales of Power, which is doing very exciting transnational, transregional work. And I'm excited to hear more about that today. The second topic, or the second paper and topic, will be by myself, Lindsay DeWitt, and I am from Ghent University. The tail end of a FWO postdoctoral research fellowship. And I was in Japan before on a JSPS research fellowship, and I hopefully won't always be on a research fellowship, but we'll see what possibilities might open up. And then we have Yanis Gaitanidis, who's tuning in from Chiba, Japan, the Graduate School of Global and Transdisciplinary Studies there. And our discussant, Levy McLaughlin, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the North Carolina State University. I come from a long line of UNC fans in my family, so I caught myself. And one more thing before we begin, kind of disclaimer. We decided as a panel that we wanted to come together in more of a roundtable type discussion, a workshop format, than presenting precise, well, they'll be precise, but polished and finished formal panels and presentations. So we've prepared our remarks with a sort of exploratory state of mind. And we look forward to interaction from everyone, really. So if you have something to say, please raise your hand or make yourself known. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Aika. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for the introduction, and many thanks to the organizers and all of you for attending today. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. Okay. From beginning. Can you see my PowerPoint? Okay. So as Lindsay said, it's been a while since we wrote these abstracts, and a couple of things have happened in the meantime. And of course, one of the things that happened was that whatever plans we may have had to do additional fieldwork on which to base these papers have not always been possible. In my case, they haven't been possible. So that's also why I will actually draw on some ethnographic material. But I will also sort of present some ideas, and this is very much work in progress. It's slow progress. There are some thoughts, some questions that I have, some hypotheses as well that I would like to share with you today, and very much looking forward also to Levy's comments, and then afterwards to the Q&A. So the title of my paper is From Folk Belief to Maritime Heritage. Quotation marks are here to suggest I'm interested in how these categories operate, and also how certain things first are classified as one thing and then maybe become classified as something else and change meaning, how that works discursively. And then a transnational comparison of nation-making practices. This is something that I think is important. We earlier today, Janis and I, some of you may have attended this, we had a roundtable discussion organized by the EAJS with the Toshiba Foundation, where we discussed, challenges, state of the field, Japanese studies, what are important, what are important challenges and opportunities as well. And one of the things that I'm interested in, or what I think is important, actually, what we do in Japanese studies, is to actually look more into the question of how certain practices, and this is of course also what we will talk about today, how certain practices are classified or come to be seen as Japanese, and how other practices are excluded from that category, right? There's been a lot of discussion about what does or does not constitute religion in the Japanese religion. Now let's ask the question, what does or does not constitute Japanese in Japanese religion? So that's one of the things I'm interested in. And I think by looking at that comparatively, transnationally, within an Asian context, I think that may shed some new lights on these kind of processes. In my own work, I'm looking at things that are happening within the modern nation state Japan, but I'm also looking at things that are happening within the modern nation state Vietnam, and I'm comparing these. Well, that's the idea. Just to start, to get us sort of to give you an idea of the kind of questions. You see here a statue of, most of you would know her as Kannon. You're probably also familiar with the fact that most people would, or that in China, she's known as Guanyin. This is actually a statue in Da Nang in Vietnam, where people know her as Guan and it's pretty much the same transnational deity, which is in fact one of the most popular and one of the most powerful deities, goddesses in all of Asia. And this is a goddess that, you know, I've come across several times in my research, my traveling in Japan and in Vietnam. Just the other day, I read a copy. I got a copy of this book, which actually I recommend to those of us who work on Japanese religion, but who actually think that we should know a bit more about Chinese religion, but in reality, we don't really know all these different Chinese gods and iconography and so on. This is a very nice guidebook with a rather interesting title from Guanyin to Chairman Mao, which is written by an author, Suiting Christine Ni, who says that her mission is, in fact, to help improve understanding of Chinese heritage. And I was really surprised. I mean, it's a useful guidebook, but I was really surprised to read her description of Guanyin as the goddess most associated with Chinese religion, and then proceeds to describe this goddess that I know as a very transnational border crossing, and not just the borders between nations, also the borders between world religions, so-called world religions and folk religion, borders between genders even. I mean, it's a very, in that sense, transgressive deity to see this deity described as one of the great examples of Chinese religious heritage. Now, my point here is not to criticize the author of this well-written, accessible, and very useful popular scientific book. My point is to actually raise the question, don't we do the same thing when we're talking about Japanese religion? Perhaps not as explicitly as she is doing, but don't we often sort of assume, tacitly assume, that certain things are Japanese and that they are perhaps much more transnational practices? Just so we all know, I think that Guanyin is worshipped throughout Southeast Asia. This is Zuyoji. This is a temple in Tokyo, which is the association with motherhood, the popular devotion that we see in Japan, and we see that in Korea, and we see that in Vietnam, and we see also that Guanyin is worshipped in various. There are, of course, the traditional, the different incarnations, the thousand arms, and so on, but also new shapes and forms, local forms of Guanyin are emerging. This is in southern Vietnam, One Am Nam Hai, the South Sea. So here, Guanyin is associated with the South Sea, or the East China, the South China Sea, the East Sea, as it's also called in Vietnam, where she's seen as a sort of life-saving maritime goddess. So there are these various shapes that emerge of this goddess. So it's a very transnational, transnational deity. So my point is actually, so what I'm interested in is asking these questions: at what point and why do certain practices, certain gods that they get classified as national, be it Chinese or be it Japanese or be it Vietnamese? Now, and that brings us to the question I think also Lindsay and Janis and Lefebvre were talking about, what constitutes Japanese religion, or what constitutes a Japanese in Japanese religion, right? So we have compared to certain other countries, we have a fairly well-established subdiscipline within religious studies, also with its own sections here at the EAJS, with its own sections at the AAR, American Academy of Religion, and here you see some titles: Yamaori Tetsuo, Umehara Takeshi, these post-war Japanese scholars of religion who have very strongly contributed to, in a way, challenging the notion that Buddhism and Shinto are two completely different things, and instead creating the idea of Nihonjin teki, shukyo ishiki, a Japanese-ness, a sort of underlying substratum that regardless of which particular denomination or which particular shrine or temple that people worship, there's this underlying foundation that the Japanese people, the nation, the volk, that the people have in common, this underlying religiosity. And in the case of Umehara, this is something I've discussed more in my earlier work on Shinto. In the case of Umehara and Sonoda Minoru and these also post-war Shinto scholars, this is closely linked to the sacred forest, the trope of the sacred forest as the place where Japanese religiosity emerges in their work. But we also see this then in English language scholarship, work of Earhart. I think this little book, it's just a little introductory textbook, but the subtitle I think is very revealing. Many traditions within one sacred way. He has another book like Unity and Diversity. Yeah. So there's this assumption that we have this thing called Japanese religion, which is a particular system, and in a way also then criticizing the primacy of doctrine and of the world religions that at the time, these are works, come up then in 1980s, 90s, that at the time was very dominant within religious studies. But then the assumption is that there is a particular system, and this of course also in the work of Reader and Tanabe, Practically Religious, which is a great study, great overview of all sorts of ritual practices that kind of breaks down this whole idea of it's all about the doctrine and the faith, and actually looks at what people are doing. But in the process, creates a particular understanding of this is the Japanese system. This is what the people have in common. And even somebody like Timothy Fitzgerald, who then criticizes these scholars for non-reflexively, not reflecting upon their use of the term religion, and then comes with an alternative anthropology of Japanese religion, where he says it's all about all sorts of ritual. He does the exact same thing when it comes to the Japanese-ness of things. He sort of takes for granted that there is a national way of doing ritual, only he doesn't call it religion. There's a national way of doing ritual that the Japanese all have in common. And the question then becomes, who gets excluded from that process? Yeah. What about Pentecostals? What about Jehovah's Witnesses? What about people who deliberately choose not to take part in Shinto rituals, Soka Gakkai, migrants who worship other religions, and of course indigenous minorities and indigenous worship traditions within the modern Japanese nation state. We see since the turn of the century, there's been lots of very good, solid historical scholarship on the formation of the category religion in Japan. The question that remains then is, okay, so we see how certain things get classified as religion, certain other things don't get classified as religion. But then the next question is not only how this relates to Meiji period state formation, but how it relates to ongoing processes, not just of state formation, but of discursive constructions of Japanese-ness. What does or does not count as Japanese, okay? So this is what I'm interested here. Just very briefly to illustrate one of the unfortunate consequences of this kind of disciplinary compartmentalization is that a popular idea, and I think very few scholars of Japanese religion would agree with it, but it's a very common idea in popular media, social media, is that the Japanese term kami is untranslatable, that this is something unique because it's so diametrically opposed to the supposedly Western, but the monotheistic idea of an omnipresent, omnipotent God. Now, here you see some pictures of a whale temple, a whale god temple in central Vietnam devoted to Om Nam Hai, which is a lord of the South Sea, a maritime god associated with whales. The font, the Chinese characters, the writing may strike you as a bit funny, but this is a jewel, so ngok, or the tama, and then we have the lun, from the Kirin, so the mythological Qilin, the mythological Chinese dragon-like or unicorn, this mythological creature, and then there's the Dien, so ngok lan Dien, or the Gyokurin Den, I assume the onyomi would be in Japanese, but a shrine devoted to this here, the mythological creature, which then becomes the whale. And I won't get into that more. You see here, you see an ihai, a tablet, and you see, of course, the character for kami. or Chinese sheng, or a Vietnamese tongue, right? These are spirits. These are powerful deities. They're everywhere. Some of them are local. Some of them are translocal. Some of them are national or populist. Some of them are deified humans. Others are mythological ancestors. It's really not that different from what's going on in Japan, right? And that's the kind of transnational comparison. If we do that, then we see that this whole generic concept of kami, there's really nothing special about it, if we look at it in a wider Asian context. So this is just to illustrate that. Okay. So then the next is the question of how does this relate to popular religion? How does it relate to heritage making? This is one of the things that I'm exploring in my project, right? The concept Japanese, we have this concept Minkan Shinko, or also Minzoku Shukyo is another term that's used, associated with or came up with pre-war Minzoku Gaku, ethnology, which is similar to the Vietnamese Ding Nguyen Yang Yang, which is likewise associated with certain notions of national traditions, what constitutes like proper national worship traditions, as opposed to the supposedly foreign world religions, right? So there's a similar, only in Vietnam it emerged post-war, but there's a similar scholarly discourse about how such ritual practices are linked to national identity. And a common idea is that these practices are local. Yeah, so I'm interested in the politics of scale here. Common idea is these are local, they're place-based, they're linked to nature, to animals, to rivers, and so on. They're often indigenous, or maybe were at some point. But then those local practices, as we see, for example, Yanagita Kunio, those local practices then are seen as the expression of a sort of national spirit. And today, this is mostly phrased in the language of heritage and becomes like intangible, very often intangible, but the places may also be tangible material heritage, but the ritual practices, the festivals are often then classified by the state as intangible cultural heritage. And for the last few years, also together with my colleague Mark Theeuwen, and also Lindsay has been involved, and several others, we've had this project looking at ways in which ritual practices and worship sites in Japan are sort of turned into heritage, right? So these reclassification processes, one thing is what happens discursively, but also the question what happens institutionally, what actually happens on the ground, how do different actors related to a place of worship when all of a sudden it becomes a UNESCO World Heritage Site, for example, or becomes listed when a local festival becomes a sort of UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. And this differs, I mean, the precise ways in which this works out differs from place to place. But what often happens is that there is a move that local actors lose some of the control or some of the access even to the site. I've written about this in the case of Seifao Taki, Sacred Grove in Okinawa. So what we see is that many of these supposedly local practices reframed as national heritage actually take shape, acquire new meanings transnationally, right? And my question is, didn't they always? Weren't those local gods always already sort of transnationally embedded? Of course, it would require more sort of historical digging as well. But so I'm really curious about how local worship traditions take place transnationally, inspired also by the work of Anat Singh. She doesn't write particularly about ritual per se, but the work of Anat Singh, Friction, these looking at how globalization works out locally. And this is what I'm doing currently in my research project, Wells of Power. As I told you, sort of some of the ethnographic work had to be postponed, but we're working on this, and actually currently 2 PhD candidates who are doing field work in Asia. Particular, one thing that fascinates me is how certain peripheral traditions that may be seen as either backward or at least are not central to national narratives, those coastal traditions associated with maritime practices or pre-modern maritime issues, how these acquire new meanings throughout East Asia as a sort of maritime national heritage, maybe the rediscovery of the ocean. This is something we see very clearly in China. Just recently, Changzhou just a couple of weeks ago, was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as a maritime emporium during the Song and Yuan periods. This is directly linked to the current Chinese government's establishment of the new maritime Silk Road, as it's called, of asserting the long history of China as a maritime power. Now, I'm not a historian of China, so I'll leave it to others to criticize that narrative. But I'm interested in how the heritage making here works to justify a particular historical narrative that has really direct present-day political implications, right? In Vietnam, we see this as well. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. In Japan, it's not entirely going there yet, but there is a move. I want to mention the groundbreaking work of Fabio Rambelli, who had this edited volume, The Sea and the Sacred in Japan, which also Lindsay had a chapter, and maybe several of the others here, well, actually now here sitting in the audience, a chapter. And this is a great edited volume because it's like moving the gaze away sort of from the mountains and from the rice and from the sort of terra-centric perspective to the ocean. And that's a way also of breaking out of these national boundaries and these categories, right? The question is, to what extent will this also lead within Japan to a reformulation of national heritage as maritime? One of the challenges there, that a tradition that I think many domestically powerful actors would like to see listed or acknowledged as important Japanese heritage, is whaling. Well, whaling is the one thing you're not going to get UNESCO to get on any of their lists, probably, because it's so contested, right? So this is this is something, I'm looking at. But the formation of maritime heritage in relation to nation building and to local, what becomes then how peripheral coastal ritual traditions all of a sudden become central in the national imagination. We see this very clearly in Vietnam today.
Micah, I don't want to interrupt, but we're a bit over 15 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So
I'm
gonna wrap up. I'm just gonna show a few pictures and then I'm gonna to the conclusion. We see this very clearly in Vietnam today, where whale festivals I mentioned in the beginning. This worship of the whale god, whale festivals that are really sort of village festivals, where they acquire new meaning now. It is seen as sort of national, central to the great maritime nation, Vietnam, which is related to territorial conflicts in the South China Sea, right? How that asserting that tradition. We see in Japan, we see also the whaling, pre-modern whaling traditions. Kaioi in Yamaguchi Prefecture was a center of Edo period coastal whaling, how new festivals are established there. These are not sort of internationally recognized per se, but they play a role domestically. New festivals are linked to existing Buddhist traditions of the worship, in this case, Kyoto for whale fetuses. One that has been listed as a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage is Kuchirabune Gyoji, which I visited in Yokkaichi a couple of years ago. In Vietnam, also, this is another example in Phan Thiet of a major whale worship temple that also then acquires this meaning. Much more I can say about this, but I'm gonna end with just a few hypotheses, suggestions, maybe that we can use for further discussion. The first is that I think I've been trying to say that it's not only so-called world religions like Buddhism and Confucianism that are shaped transnationally. That also applies to so-called local or national folk religions. So it's important, both historically and today, like to look at how they shape transnationally. The other is that because of this methodological nationalism, because of this reification of Japanese religion, setting it apart as a system, that we need more in-depth transnational comparative studies. And there are some good examples. I'm not saying it hasn't been done, just don't get me wrong, but I think we need much more of this. And third is that local folk beliefs, popular religion, have been rediscovered as national heritage, and that scholars of religion, scholars of Asia, the reclassification of religion as heritage is becoming increasingly important for understanding also present-day politics of culture. So sorry for going a bit too long, going over time. And Lindsay, you're next.
Thank you, Aika.
Stop here.
Okay, I will share my screen. Levy, can you confirm that you just see my slide? Okay, great. Hello again, everyone. My presentation will continue in the vein of some of Aika's remarks on the strategic employment and deployment of certain religious practices, local folk beliefs as national as Japanese heritage and tradition. What does the nation state embrace or sanction, put up with, or hold on to, and why? And what changes do we see over time? For those of you who are familiar with me or my work, you know I have a enduring thematic preoccupation with this topic, nyonin kinsei, nyonin kekkai, prohibitions against women, or proscriptions, literally boundaries for women, typically ascribed to sacred mountains, the most famous example being Mount Omine, where we will visit in just a moment, but also from other putative sacred spaces like the sumo wrestling ring, which I'll also talk about today, and other social milieus in the name of maintaining spatial purity, ritual efficacy, in the name of men's concentration, because women are distracting, or the divine propitiation related to weather and agriculture and hunting and fishing cultures connected to jealous female deities. It's a very rich topic full of excellent scholarship and also lacuna. And so it's been endlessly interesting for me. And I'm finishing my monograph, and I'm using today as an opportunity to talk about kind of the longue durée of what I've been looking at, which includes 3 case studies. So first, I'll talk about what kind of naturally came to be as the orienting paradigm for my remarks today. I've looked at Henri Lefebvre's theoretical model of the production of social space and of spatial practice. And I realized when I was preparing for this panel and when Aika and I were conceiving of it, that there are so many different ways of thinking about inclusion and exclusion, hence our parentheses in the title of the panel. And especially in terms of my topic, which is very explicitly, overtly about included and excluded bodies or embodied experiences. But our main driving impetus for creating the panel was to, as Aika has already discussed, talk about representations of inclusion and exclusion, how space is conceived, and also the representational spaces of and for inclusion and exclusion. And here I'm thinking about this national category formation, ideas and national imaginaries of Japan, Japaneseness. So I think his model is helpful not only for people like me who have worked on sacred space, spatial practice in various contexts, but also because it emphasizes and highlights the mutual constitution of the social and the spatial alongside the sacred and even the nation. And I think all of those are relevant for all of our talks today. So first, let's go to the base of in Nara Prefecture. Here you have the infamous or famous gate from which, beyond which women may not pass. And this is kind of the presentation of Mount Omine as this place of secret rituals that encapsulate and embody traditional Japanese religious culture. And this has been celebrated and acknowledged as a UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Site. And the second site of my research is Okinoshima, which is an island, but it shares many similarities with Omine-san in that it is a site that's set apart. It's off limits to women for religious reasons, and it's also a World Heritage Site. So here you have a few images to orient yourself with Okinoshima. On the left, this is the newly completed or refurbished, rebuilt in 2018, small shrine structure on the island. And these men you see in this image are officially, in principle, the only people allowed to step foot on the island today. Although, as you see in the image on the right, that was not always the case, and it still is not always the case. The most important thing being that no women step on the island. And I'd also like to point out in the photo on the right, you see the rising sun flag, and that's become a point of contention in the discourse on Okinoshima's place in Japan's national and cultural imaginary. And I'll circle back to that. And then the third site we'll be talking about today is the dohyo, or the professional sumo wrestling ring. This is the newest realm I've traveled to, or traveled to the border or periphery of as a woman, with its controversial and also characteristic rule against women, young girls included, entering or even touching that earthen packed earth ring. And here you have some images that show you kind of the popular national cultural imaginings of sumo wrestling. You have on the left-hand side a ring entering ceremony with really just fully teeming with religious and constructed religious significance. And you also have in the center, you have a ceremony that is consecrating the ring as a sacred space, with men dressed as Shinto priests who are not lawful Shinto priests. They inter talismanic objects in the center of the ring, and they purify it as a sacred space that is then populated by deities. And on the right-hand side, you have a different kind of man entering the ring. That is he himself, Donald Trump, who was invited to have his own kind of championship trophy and to deliver that from within the ring. And the notion of who can step inside the ring, even to deliver a prize, has been a huge topic of controversy in Japan. I won't have time to talk about it today, but I have an article forthcoming on sumo wrestling, the first of a project I've begun, and there will be 2 more articles forthcoming as well. And the first one should be out in the next week or so, hopefully by the end of the month. So interested parties, please stay tuned. Okay, so the main body of what I want to speak about today is what I'm calling the lives and afterlives of Nyonin Kinsei, this religion-based exclusion of women. And what I'm doing for my monograph is charting the trajectory over time from 1872, for reasons I'll explain, until 2018, which was the last major bubbling up of the public controversy over the topic. Why 1872? Well, 1872, on the one hand, was the first year that Kyoto had an exhibition that would be welcoming foreigners. Here you have a cartoon rendition of that very event. This was a monumental occasion for Kyoto and for Japan, as is well known in the field, for displaying what Japan is as a nation. And alongside that, the same year, and in fact motivating, using that exhibition as a motivating factor, you have the Ground Council of State Edict number 98, which abolishes in principle any practices of prohibiting women on shrine and temple lands and opening all mountain lands for the purpose of worship. And the text on this further notes that, a text from 1936 rather, not the Meiji text, notes that it's a decisive reformation from the standpoint of modern civilization. And most places complied with this, but not Omine-san, as we know. Then we have 1936. So from 1872 until 1936, a lot has changed in the political, social, cultural landscapes from that time, including the strategic development of a national park system. And in the second round of designations of national parks in Japan, you have Yoshino Kumano, which includes Mount Omine. Here's a small map. And alongside that, women's entry or prohibition from that mountain. And after much debate, heated debate between both sides, publications on both sides from various religious authorities connected to the mountain, and from people from Tokyo, so-called outsiders, you have a band of people coming together that includes the National Park Commission representatives, local devotee representatives, local representatives of the major villages at the entrances, so Dorogawa, today it's called Tenkawa, and Yoshino. And you also have a confraternity, a religious confraternity spokesman. They formed a coalition and unanimously agreed on a mountain rule, a set of mountain rules, in fact, that has at its helm the prohibition of women. And this was sent to and then sanctioned by the Nara prefectural governor. So what I'm doing with these examples is drawing out from these larger case studies, much larger case studies on each of these sites, specific contingent spatial imaginaries connected to the idea of the nation. In 1946, you have the next one, and this one doesn't come from the Japanese government per se, but from the occupying forces. You have a sign posted at the entrances of the mountain in Dorogawa and Yoshino that says, as you can read, the traditions of this shrine are over 1,200 years old and are in effect that no woman has ever been able to visit herein. In recognizing the religious rights of this country, all occupational personnel are enjoined to observe this tradition. And this was posted in response to an American woman's reported attempt to climb the mountain to transgress the sacred space, which incited an angry mob who gathered and had to be quelled from acting out violently against her and the group of people from Tokyo who came and who she was about to climb. And then we have, moving forward a long way, but another, what I'm calling contingent spatial imaginary in 2004 with the UNESCO World Heritage designation of sacred sites and pilgrimage routes in the Key Mountain Range. Here, I have not included any text because there was nothing to be said about women's exclusion from the mountain, despite a great deal of opposition. On the right, you see a photograph of on-site protest at the gate at the southern entrance in Dorogawa to the mountain. You have people asking to not ignore sexual minorities, to end women's exclusion. You had people protesting on the steps of Kimpusenji and Yoshino, a big temple. You had a petition that was signed by over 12,000 people sent to the national government and UNESCO. But when it ended up at the World Heritage Committee, it's not unsurprising, perhaps, given the formal nature of that event, but there was nothing said at all about this. And in fact, in all of the heritage documentation that was written by the Japanese national authorities and accepted by the World Heritage Committee and is now published, which in essence becomes an international history of the site, it says only that the Omine area developed as a site for mountain ascetic practices more than 1,200 years previously and was recognized as far as China. And as I've talked about and written about elsewhere, this reference to China is very specific, specifically related to a text that is the first evidence of women being excluded from the site. So you have a text from the 9th century, the Giso Dokujo in Japanese. It's a Chinese text. It's a monk's recollections, sort of encyclopedic recollections of so-called travels in Japan. There's been some doubts over the authenticity of it. And it says that no women have been able to enter. So there's clearly some selective envisioning and erasing of important characteristics of the site here. In 2017, we have a very similar situation with the World Heritage designation of Sacred Island of Okinoshima and associated sites in the Munakata region. And here, the Philippine delegates, they asked Japan to explain women's exclusion from the site. And in response, as I've made a screenshot from the YouTube video of the proceedings, you have the female ambassador, the only female ambassador on the permanent delegation of Japan to UNESCO, Kunisato, and she read in English, "We would like to clarify that as a matter of principle, the access to the island of Okinoshima has been restricted to the priests of the Munakata Grand Shrine, and priests are male by its tradition." In this case, you have even more public criticism. I've just grabbed a few snapshots of interesting news headlines from around the world and in English for the ease of audience readers here who might not be able to read Japanese. There was a lot of opposition against it. But again, the Japanese government, this was their official statement on it, their position, which was those short 30 words. And then in 2018, you have perhaps the most controversial, at least in terms of international and national media headlines and continued coverage of women's incursion and attempted incursion into the professional sumo ring, a trio of incidents in April 2018, which I imagine most, if not all of you, have heard about in some capacity, given the media coverage the world over. A mayor outside of Kyoto in Maizuru fell over unconscious while giving a welcoming greetings inside the ring. Female medics rushed in, performed CPR, and about 1 minute into their life-saving activities were ordered to exit the ring and men to enter the ring. A few days later, the photo in the bottom left, you can see this is the Mayor Tomoko Nakagawa of Takarazuka City. And she did not know that mayors typically give their remarks from inside the ring until this incident happened a few days earlier in Maizuru. And she asked to give her remarks from inside the ring, as should be the case with all mayors. She thought, and she was refused. So she used her moment, and here's a picture of the moment where she gave her welcoming remarks, which were not so much welcoming remarks, but they were remarks directed at the Sumo Association and other traditionalists in Japan about the topic of the exclusion of women and gender discrimination and human rights. And then on the right-hand side, the photos we have a few days later, girls were for several years, from 2015 at least, allowed to participate in these for fun sumo exhibitions that allowed kids to go in the room and sort of grapple with the sumo tori. And here you see a young girl doing it in 2015. Well, on the same day that the mayor collapsed in Maizuru, the Sumo Association, the Nihon Sumo Kyokai, handed down a directive that banned girls from participating in that. So here, in terms of responses, because that's what I'm interested in, right? There's national imaginings. First, you have the Sumo Association issues this long statement explaining and defending their tradition on the grounds of sumo being a kami ritual, a shinji, and kami in this case being definitely exclusively Japanese, a sacred battlefield, shinsei no tatakaiba, and on the grounds of protecting Japanese traditional culture. And other esteemed fans, like one of the members of the Tokyo Sumo Journalist Club, this was posted on one of the national television networks on their show, explaining exactly why women are not allowed into the ring. And here you have all the trappings of this sort of national myth of an agrarian nation, at the helm of which is a female deity. And in this case, it's a jealous female deity of the sumo ring. And another very interesting element that is a new sort of adding a new point of consideration to the longstanding debate over tradition versus gender discrimination is came out of the public hearings, the governmental hearings that were held regarding the sumo controversy in April. And here you have the state minister of the cabinet office who spoke, and this is one example of many. The current prime minister, Suga, his remarks were very similar as well. There's no judgment on the Sumo Association because they hold rights as a matter of corporate autonomy. They are a public interest juridical person that receives incredible tax breaks and tax incentives, and they operate in principle in the public interest. And the official government perspective here is a matter of corporate autonomy, which in essence sanctions the practice. So what I'm interested in is this trajectory over time of these contingent national imaginaries from 1872 to 2018, and of course, until the present day and beyond. And in the Meiji period, we have the narrative of prohibitions against women emerging. Before that, you have, there's excellent scholarship on this, for example, from Abe Yasudo, and there are scattered references throughout history to women's exclusion, but nothing even close to a coherent institutional structure that we could chart across various spaces that were connected. And pre-modern literary references seem to describe something that's different, very different from what the modern practice is like. So it's almost like Hansel and Gretel, they're dropping breadcrumbs. There's no whole narrative. It's all constructed out of different cloths, and yet supporters of the female taboo, they codify that dynamic and unstable patchwork of mismatched cloths as something ancient and traditional, and things ancient and traditional glimmer with a shiny patina of the past that humans and nation states find attractive and very useful. So I think through the window of religion-based female taboos, Nonin Kinsei, we can see historical shifts in the way that space is produced and experienced, imagined at various levels, most importantly for this panel, along national lines, alongside changes in social attitudes and conventions. And the vicissitudes from rejection to embracing, with the latter emerging as the clear victory. And I think that's particularly interesting because the trajectory of attitudes towards the exclusion of women runs counter to the standard, of course, grossly uneven narrative of advances in gender equality over the past 150 years. So I think we need to think about how tradition or selective embracings, clinging to some idea of the past, serve certain individuals and social forms, especially contingent corporate forms, thanks to this wonderful article in 2020, published and co-authored by Aika and Levy and two other authors. The so-called traditional image of Japan, which includes the gender taboo, is an image that people, the public, no one needs to tap into it and be part of it. And indeed, individuals are more likely to not be part of it. They don't want to, it's not in vogue to say, I think women should not enter these certain spaces. And indeed, in terms of sumo, you have public national opinion polls that show that the majority of the Japanese public is against women being excluded from sacred sites. But it's something that certain groups and the nation at large, these collectivities, can tap into strategically when they need it. No one's bound to it. It can be criticized, brushed aside as a quaint remnant from the past, anachronistic, something to be disparaged. So we have these multiple connotations that sometimes contradict each other. And the negative images are certainly what the press latches onto. But I think we need to focus on the agencies, institutions, corporate forms that give life to these taboos and find utility in its continued rarefication. So the national government, the Sumo Association, temples and shrines, and then ideas, of course, idealizations and sentimentalism of an imagined past, geopolitical footing and soft power, the World Heritage Regime, the Olympics. So these are the things I'm interested in, these carefully curated and exclusive envisionings and the atmosphere of these national cultural imaginings. I know that I'm over my time, so I'm gonna wrap up short here, and hopefully we can come back to a few of these things at the end. Here are some images from the sites I've been speaking of. You have national stamps of Yoshino-Kumano National Park. You have the rising sun flag and images of Okinoshima. You have the sumo wrestlers who are living gods at Meiji Shrine. And I'm thinking of this in terms of a double identity. I'm working on, this is the workshopping part of my presentation. I'm working on bringing all these ideas, weaving all these case studies into a tidy monograph form and wrangling the different case studies into a cohesive narrative that incorporates theoretical insights that illumine that data. So one thing I've been thinking about, which is influenced by Yoshioka Hiroshi's work on self-colonization of the Japanese, is this give and take of encounters. So you don't just have an even attitude toward a certain social practice or a certain idea of the past. You have a multiplicity of attitudes, an unevenness, as Henri Harutunian's recent work describes it, this enduring presence of the past. This floating character and elusiveness in discourse. And this is what Yoshioka calls a samurai discourse. I'm going to end here. And if there's time at the end too, I'd be happy to talk about Mount Athos, which is a parallel example, but a very different placement within national discourses and narratives. So with that, I'm going to end. Apologies again for taking more time. You know how it goes. You just get talking and then you get excited and it happens. So I will pass on to Yanis at this point. Thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. I hope people can see my screen now. All right, so today my presentation is about the study of spirituality in Japan. I've been involved in this for a few years now, and I'm putting the final touches on a monograph that has been yet to be reviewed. So it's a perfect chance here to try out some ideas. Unfortunately, unlike the other two presenters, I don't have nice pictures to show, but mostly book covers, because I'm talking about scholarly work and discourse, and how Japan making can be seen in the study of spirituality in Japan, but not just, but I'm also interested in how this has been developed in relation and in in conjunction with larger, wider, if you want, developments in the study of religion in general. So I think perhaps people have read the work of Van der Veer and his ideas about spirituality as a Euro-American modern term intimately related to the imperial expansion of Christianity, to the emergence of new varieties of religious experiences at home and abroad, in conjunction with that expansion, and of course to the development of the comparative study of religion in academia and in popular format as well. But some of the consequences, I think, of this can be found in the scholarly, in the way that critique has been raised against spirituality in general, and holistic spirituality in academia, and in the way that that critique resembles, or the way that holistic spirituality is criticized resembles the way that Japanese religion has been described. So you might recognize some of the arguments here from Eike's presentation. In the sense, so immediately, I think I always find this quite interesting, how classic critiques of the New Age, for example, on the left here on your screen, present, of course, spirituality as a postmodern orientation with emphasis upon eclecticism, individualist experimentation, and a pick-a-mix approach to religious tradition. And this can be found also in sometimes scholarly, but also popular exegesis of Japanese religiousness, let's say, here on the right, which present Japanese religion as a monolithic kind of system, as Eike mentioned, that is and not that expresses a lifetime that is not dedicated to a single moral tradition, but is individualistic, utilitarian, consumerist, and something that a lot of descriptions that interestingly are common with New Age criticism as well. And I find this interesting because it often comes up in scholarly books about Japanese non-religiousness, so-called non-religiousness, religiousness, and the expression that also was taught at university, that is often used as a kind of key word to understand everything about Japanese religion, that expression kurishi toki no kamidanomi, which is this idea of one seeks out the deities in times of trouble, that at least since the 70s and until very recently has been playing this kind of key role. If you want to understand Japanese religion, in inverted commas, and ironically, of course, you need to basically use that and understand that concept. So, of course, there is this Christian monotheistic, I guess, and a lot of other kind of bias in this. But I'm also interested in something else, and this has to do with how the study of spirituality in Japan has also been associated with a certain national crisis. So perhaps a lot of the early work on spirituality, especially the work that was published at the beginning of the 21st century, always included some kind of chapter about the post-95 crisis, crisis of values, economic crisis, political crisis, demographic crisis, homelessness, social collapse, public consciousness rising about inequalities, and aging society, and all kinds of arguments that I'm not saying they're not true, but they're very interestingly put in conjunction with either the need of spirituality or the rise of spirituality, the problem of the spiritual business, and some kind of spiritual crisis really happening. And this, I argue in this paper, has at least could be drawn back to the 1970s development of studies of new religions, and how this moved into the study of spirituality. So here I'm not going to read this quote, but this is from the end of the Sociology of Spirituality, this book where Yu Miyama Sensei argues that there is this contemporary age has a spirituality crisis, and if you read this paragraph, you realize how much there is also a hidden idea about something that we are missing, or something that is not being done very well, as some kind of religious essence that we need back, in a sense. Now, I think it's important to put this in perspective also in regards to the study of religion in general. And I would argue that like in the case of at the end of the 90s and early 2000s, we have studies on the left here that moved beyond the concept of popular religion, where we had proponents of a study of religion in ordinary life, like vernacular religion, implicit religion, everyday religion, lived religion, and which pushed for a focus on the embodiment and enactment of religion, regardless of the officiality of where that happens. So regardless of popular or high culture or low culture, etc. Spirituality allowed certain scholars of religion in Japan to do the same, in a sense, and leave behind the heavily criticized by then Minshu Shukyo, a popular religions approach that had characterized also the study of religion, and especially new religions in the second half of the 20th century. So the movement was, in a sense, in conjunction with a larger movement in religious studies, but perhaps the down point, if you want, the problem that I would like to focus on is that the central message of this original Minshu Shukyo approach did not disappear. The main message being that religion could be salvific, even therapeutic individually, but also nationally therapeutic. Now, perhaps people might be aware, and a lot of people are aware of this idea that Minshu Shukyo originated with the 1950s and 1960s historical studies of 19th century religious movements. There is a big chapter, and there is a note about this in the Nanzan Guide of Religion in Japan. And there is also and we know that in the 1970s and 1980s, sociologists of religion like Nishiyama Shigeru and Shimazono Susumu expanded the scope of these predecessors, these historians who focused on new religions and tried to draw from those movements common characteristics that they associated uniquely with sometimes a Japanese culture. And the concept of Minshu Shukyo is in fact central to Shimazono Susumu's thesis of salvation in modern religions, and can be traced back to a footnote in his first ever monograph in 1992, which was about so-called new religions. But he actually there refers to Araki Michio and his book in which he describes this Minshu Shukyo. And in the book, of course, Araki's book, he's an Eliadian. I think Eliade, the name figures on the cover here. And as Satoko Fujiwara has argued, Araki was undoubtedly an Eliadian, and he argues, when he argues in his book, that the religiosity at the center of new religions is the same as that of the traditional religions that have existed in Japan since ancient times, and which are the antithesis of the religiosity of the Jewish and Christian West. Now, what is important is that when we have these interesting debates about Minshu Shukyo, the 70s also witnessed a lot of Japanese translations of literature that sought to conceptualize religious change, especially change after the 1960s. And so we had translations of Carlos Castaneda's The Teachings of Don Juan. We have Michel Eliade's The Quest, Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols, Thomas Luckman's Invisible Religion, Rajneesh, The Search, so not just academic books, and Peter Berger's The Secret Canopy. All these books were translated in Japanese in the 70s. So Isoma Junichi, in the book in the middle here, argues that the reaction of scholars in Japan who read that literature was to look into religion for possibilities of a kind of an anarchic world, free from the rules of the real world, and the lay religious groups that appeared throughout the 19th century provided the model for such possibilities. And more recently, Nagaoka Takashi has even pointed out that most of these immediate post-war studies of Minshu Shukyo used Omoto as a kind of case study of complex, which originally Omoto, at the time already, when these historians looked into it, had gone through a second generation of believers, and a lot of changes have happened, but Nagaoka points out that these were, in a sense, simplified to fit a concept of popular religion that was meant as a critique of post-war Japanese society, which the post-war scholars saw leaning towards conservatism and capitalist everyday life, influenced by the Japan-US security alliance and Japan's economic miracle. At the same time, we have also Hisao Otsuka, who, as a chief translator of Max Weber's text into Japanese, sought to apply also Weberian theory to Japanese religions, and dividing world religions like Shinto, according to him, from ethnic religions like Shinto against rejecting religions like Buddhism and Christianity. Now, foundations of these ideas, as you probably know, had been laid down by Bella in his Tokugawa religion, which stretched Eurocentric narratives of modernity to argue that the popular values that him and other historians like Yasumaru exemplify, found in the Edo period, like diligence, thrift, humility, and filial piety, could play a role analog to Weber's thesis of Protestant ethics. Now, the 70s and 80s, when this was debated, it was all, and with the new literature that looked into religious change after the 1960s, we find a critique of these theories. But the underlying idea that there is a lay morality that could transform and save Japanese society survived onwards into new religions and later spirituality. Shimazono Sumu, who actually translated Habits of the Heart, or co-translated, sorry, Habits of the Heart, disagreed with Weber, and he argued that new religions were an attempt to recover the bonds tying human to human and human to the world. And he remains committed to the belief that Bella's belief that there is some kind of dormant moral social order, and that could inspire critical and therapeutic functions of religion. And this is why we have these new religions in Japan, later leading to spirituality. And this is why in his latest book, Horie Norichika talks about Minshu spirituality. So where we find again this Minshu here as a kind of a popular a translation of popular religion, but with underlying unifying functions. So at the same time, it's worth noting that Shimazono's description of the evolution of religion in post-industrial societies does not differ from that of James Beckford's description of the new type of spirituality that Beckford saw developing both within and outside religious institutions. This happened in conjunction and discussion with other scholars at the time. And they were also, Shimazono was influenced also by Habermas and the conceptualization of religion as a cultural resource. But there is this, of course, additional element that we constantly find even in literature like this today, where there is an attempt to provide alternative scenarios to Western, in inverted commas, theories, and which often means mostly Christian or Protestant approaches. And often America and the United States and the American continent, the North America is the comparative lens, if you want, that these descriptions are made. So their value, the developments of spirituality theories, value is often comparative, and often leads to unwillingly perhaps this association with sui generis religiosity, or as we can see here sui generis Japanese. And so, and I don't have any kind of conclusion. I only have a question, really, and this about this problem of scholars aiming to speak for a nation's good moods and values, while very much being aware they are themselves in constant discussion with theories and scholarly work from across the globe, and ask therefore, how is it that what allows scholars to make of phenomena such as spirituality relevant signs of religious change and national crisis, but also simultaneously permits also a differentiation between a national Japanese religiosity, let's say, and a universal religiosity, as many of these authors have talked about a global spirituality. That is all. Thank you for listening.
Yanis. So now it will be my duty to turn it over to our discussant, Levi.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Aika. Thank you, Yanis, for your fascinating work. In the spirit of sharing ideas and puzzling through conundra, and also in the interest of not taking up too much time, I'm going to dive in. What I've done basically is puzzle through the written versions of your papers and thrown together a few key points, and then suggested some synthetic takeaways, which may or may not misrepresent what you intended to express, but I hope will at least stimulate some conversation. Okay, so this will be this is the only image I'm going to use. This will be familiar to, especially to Lindsay. These are Shinshoku bathing naked at Okinoshima. Okay. I'm going to start with Aika's presentation and the paper he sent us. So I'm going to just hit upon a few key themes and basically narrate what I saw him saying. Aika notes the unsettling, what he calls it, the ease with which a transnational goddess is framed as a national one. And he talks about the movement of variously named Kannon, Gwanan, Gwanum, Avarokiteshvara that are erased in this popular presentation he introduced us to as a Chinese claim on the deity Guanyin. And he suggests this exemplifies, as he puts it, the tacit assumption that certain cultural traditions are national. And this leads into a discussion of how Guanyin as unproblematically Chinese is an artifact of scholarly and vernacular divisions that underlie nation-based claims of uniqueness. And this uniqueness discourse is almost always positioned in binary opposition to something called Western religion. And we've seen this already just now with Yanis, and I would suggest also in Lindsay's treatments as well. And turning to Japan specifically, Aika points out that generations of scholarly discourse on Japan these generations have reaffirmed what he calls an underlying substratum of all Japanese religion, reified as a single national system. And this is a unity that is necessarily opposed to this Western monotheism. And so I think what the main point that I saw Aika making is that whereas there's been a lot of ink spilled about reassessing the category religion in the phrase Japanese religion, there's been very little attempt to question the Japanese part of that. So in Japanese and European, UK, North American discourse, the Japanese nation state is accepted as an a priori, unified, essentially a historical whole. And so he instead proposes that we move beyond methodological nationalism. I love that term, by the way, and I'm using it liberally and doing my best to cite you as much as possible when I do so, Aika. Is it, and so he asks this provocative question, is not the question how and for what purpose did scholars and or state actors classify ritual practice X as Japanese religion at least as important as how and for what purpose did scholars and or state actors classify ritual practice X as Japanese religion, right? And I like that emphasis. Here's the question I have for you. This is going forward. These are the questions that popped into my mind as I read your work and listened to you speak. I go, what would sabotaging methodological nationalism look like? What would this sabotage entail? What would it produce? what would take shape in its wake. So some of this is obviously being articulated in your projects right now, but this last part, I'm a little still unclear on what would be take shape in its wake. And it raises questions like, are there benefits, say, of the EAJS that would be lost if we sabotage methodological nationalism too much? Funding, et cetera, also comes to mind. And I'm going to use a horrible neologism, but what does de-uniquing, it's an awful word, but I might use it, yield? So you demystify kami, I think, very effectively through regional comparison. But what do we learn thereby through the nature, about the nature of the nation state and its accompanying conceptual and legal appurtenances, the religious, the secular, this category of culture, category of tradition? I think I'd like to see more clear articulation about those things. And I think I would take the third of the three hypotheses that you raised in your paper. How should scholars of religion in Asia situate present-day configurations of folk tradition as national heritage? So what's your objective ultimately? I can see the deconstruction. I'm more interested now in the construction, what comes about. Okay, turning to Lindsay's paper, The Double Identity of Women's Religious Exclusion. And at the beginning, Lindsay asks the question, what can an exclusionary practice and its attendant discourses reveal about national self-images? Then there's all kinds of provocative, really subtle thinking going on throughout her written version that I received. So Lindsay considers implications of nonin kinsei or nonin kekkai, as she puts it, for the formation and functioning of natural, cultural, religious unity. And I think necessarily those chunky, problematic terms remain sort of as heuristics that we must contend with. And I like how she puts it. She said, identifies what she calls a Janus-faced cultural image, in which simultaneously there's an affirmation of Meiji era abolishment of prohibitions against women at sacred sites and an enabling of those prohibitions as hallowed exemplars of traditional Japaneseness. And this is a selective process, as she laid out for us. There is a curious effect that she didn't emphasize in her presentation just now, but what came across to me in the written version. The manner in which prohibition enacts a phenomenon. So there's a funny way of preventing something actually articulates it. And so it gives it legal and conceptual weight. So she made, I think, a very useful comparison between comparing the prohibition of women in sacred sites like Okinoshima, Omine-san, and the conundrum of Meiji era decriminalization of clerical marriage. And so she emphasizes a continuity of gender disparity between these, and the gender is missing in much of our consideration of the national, of course, always, especially I would argue in Japan. So just as female renunciants tended to maintain their vows after 1872, the edict that allowed Buddhist clerics to marry, eat meat, drink alcohol, and things like that, so too did abolishing prohibitions against women in sacred sites focus attention on proscriptions of their behavior. It kind of created a keen attention to it. So this led into a genealogy of national and international level discourses, legal wrangling, other articulations of difference that underlie defenses of Japaneseness in Japan. So major questions that occurred to me include things like, how is Japan enacted by strategic uses of taboo against women and historical rejections of those taboos? So what are we to make of ways traditions have been selectively embraced and prepared or papered over, to formulate Japan? So there's a whole pile of all kinds of relevant and intriguing examples that come together in this nation-making process. And the list that I saw in Lindsay's paper included the national government, the sumo association, powerful temples and shrines, idealization and sentimentalism of my imagined past, geopolitical footing and soft power, economic power, nation branding, Nihon Jinron, global and domestic heritage schemes, the Olympics. I mean, this is a lot of shit, right? There's a ton of stuff happening here. But what I'm curious about, and I'd love to see articulated, maybe in a way that does not do justice to every one of these things, is how does exclusion bring them together? What is this act of excluding doing? And I think that might be a really helpful unifying strategy. Yanis's paper, I got a lot out of this. There's so much happening here. making alternative religion Japanese. So Yannis's Discourse on Discourse, his discussion of how the study of spirituality in Japan has reinforced Japan making. I saw as a continuity throughout it, this anxiety about lack, an anxiety about absence. So there's a focus on a lack. There's this absence that underlies discourse on spirituality in Japan, and it's fundamentally conservative in ways that I think would offend people who do not describe themselves as conservative. And so there's an implicit hierarchy that valorizes presence over absence, like real religion versus something that doesn't exist. There's an affirmations over doubt, a simultaneous pushing down of spirituality into this kind of autochthonous natural religion that's a substrate of Japaneseness, that goes along with this concern, this hand-wringing about the absence of a stable religion with clear contours upon which the Japanese nation could rest, right? There's this constant tension that underlies not just the discourse that's put together by practitioners and nationalist defenders, but also by the scholars themselves. I see that coming through very strongly. So Yannis connects the scholarly discourse on the absence of what you might call real religion in Japan with anxieties about precarity. And this, I like what he did with this. He notes this rush to blame every imaginable kind of national crisis on the lost decades, which is seemingly the wellspring for all imaginable ills. There's almost a comical collection of just every imaginable kind of social crisis. A vital point, I think this is buried a little bit in the presentation and in the written paper, but I'd love to see put at the top, which is the capacity of all of this to be a form of national therapy. So there's so much of discourse on spirituality focuses on the individual. It focuses on the atomized, right? On not so much as parishioners and community members, but on clients, right? So much of that discourse. But instead, what Yannis is pointing out for us is that spirituality is most importantly nationally therapeutic. And I think that that's kind of new, that attention at least is sort of new. I would like to see more on that. Spirituality emerges as a fundamentally conservative reaction against the narcissism of Iashi, this focus on spirituality. And it's one that promises to ameliorate the malaise of the lost decades. It signals a return to the reassuring communalism that's promised by this perhaps dormant Minshu Shukyo. And so there's a kind of fuzziness between the discourses themselves and the scholarly analyses of them. These really do go hand in hand. So Yannis notices enthusiasm in Japanese scholarly discourse for lay religious groups of the 19th and early 20th centuries that modeled heartening possibilities for unitary Japanese religious community. So there's a romanticism to this hearkening back of a largely imagined communal Japanese past. And it occurs to me as I was reading it, who's part of this communalism, right? Who gets to be part of it, who doesn't get to be part of it? The gender is utterly missing, right? This is something where I think the combination of Lindsay's and Yannis's observations is desperately needed. And also there's all kinds of ironies. So the movements that so many people are valorizing as this kind of primordial Japanese experience are now ironically largely regarded as marginal new religions. Talked about the fact that Omoto was the focus that Nagaoka-san points out in his new study, right? I mean, talk about the ultimate scapegoat, right, in Japanese history. But yet these are now regarded as possessing soteriological potential for Japan, something that has remained in the background of spirituality as well, as Yannis points out. So the underlying this rise of spirituality is an anxiety about loss of moral social order that was understood to undergird the country. And this anxiety fuels urgency. It's this urgency that underlies the Minshu spirituality, which I think is a very deftly put together phrase by Horie-san, and the call to return to an essential Japanese primordialism that other scholars implicitly or explicitly invoke, right? And sometimes in very non-critical ways, I would say. So here's the question, one of the questions that came to me as I was reading Yannis's work and thinking about what he was saying. Can we paint a picture to replace an absence? There's so much focus on not. In those slides just now, there's always the word not and mu kept popping up to me. Well, so what do alternatives to scholarship that does not take Minshu Shukyo for granted look like? What's required to compose the palette to paint this picture? How might scholars paint a picture of spirituality that does not recapitulate negative definitions? Would the category spirituality remain operative in that case even? I'm not even sure. What kinds of reassessments must we undertake? What would they produce? This is also similar to my thoughts about Aika's work too. What's going to come about in this kind of deconstructive act? And I think it's going to make there's lots of things I think that are shared between all three papers. I'm just going to make one suggestion as a launching point for the 2 minutes of discussion that we have. So all three papers explicitly and implicitly deal with anxieties, I think. They talk about anxieties, specifically about deficiencies, lacks, absences, reversals, negative definitions, not exclusively, of course. And I'm being overly stark here for the sake of being somewhat polemical to get some conversation rolling, but which presences should we emphasize and what do those emphases produce? Thank you for listening. Appreciate this a lot.
So I just replies immediately. Thanks, Levy. That was an absolutely great summary and some really, really good questions. And I'm sure we can continue this conversation for a very long time, and we will. But just very briefly, you had your three questions. The one is, you mentioned sabotaging methodological nationalism. That's not, I wouldn't use the word sabotaging, but first I think we should become aware, there should be sort of awareness of it, right? But what would get lost? Let me just stress that I don't challenge the importance of in-depth knowledge of language, of places, of people, of things, practices. I think that's extremely valuable, and that's what area studies brings positively, constructively. So let me just stress that. But that doesn't have to be framed within the natural category of the nation state. So we have to denaturalize the nation state by actually, and that will help us to actually probably better understand those particulars in question. And then we can start looking at comparatively. And that can be either within the borders of a nation state or across. But we shouldn't just reify those borders to begin with. I hope that makes sense. And then it can be also a constructive process. And that's your second question about the kami. What does it bring to say, okay, well, kami are not uniquely Japanese? Yeah, but they are diverse. They are colorful. They are fun. They are weird. They're quirky. They're all these kinds of different things. And then they're used by people for all sorts of ideological purposes, right? Deified heroes, deified ancestors. Why do some deified spirits? Why are some turned into national kami? Yasukuni is the most obvious example from Japan. I can give you several examples from Vietnam, while others are excluded from the discourse, often female spirits, right? There's an amazing, give you amazing titles about Vietnam. So again, look at the particulars, what people are doing with them, leaving that sort of national, or looking at how they turned into a national thing. Right, so that would be my sort of constructive argument for a constructive approach. And then last, what you said about heritage making, what does this matter when rituals are turned into heritage? One thing, it matters on large scale international politics, right? Thailand and Cambodia nearly got into a really big war over a UNESCO World Heritage Site with competing narratives there at the border, a Khmer temple. So that's one thing. Japan and Korea, again, Japan's in a major conflict again with UNESCO because they didn't keep their promise to actually tell the audiences coming to Gunkanjima, the industrial, major period industrial sites, to actually tell them about the history of forced labor at that site. And that was a diplomatic deal. So there's the diplomacy, there's the international politics of this. But locally, there's also the exclusion of local actors, especially indigenous sacred sites. I've written about the Seifo Taki. I see there's a Cham sacred sites in Vietnam, Shiretoko in Hokkaido. So when sites are turned into heritage, especially indigenous worship sites, there is a process also of displacement and exclusion. And it matters, and we should write about this. So leave it there. Much more we could talk later.
Just to piggyback off of that, in the case of Okinoshima, since the designation, you have this invented, constructed history pre-designation of women's exclusion being always a fact at the island. But since the designation, which requires that the shrine changed its policy. Now nobody can go there. So you don't have the once yearly trip where 250 men go and have a special experience there. Although with the opening of the shrine, the photo I showed, the background of that photo was about 50 different shrine parishioners who accompanied that trip too. But since the island has become more off limits, they have excluded any mention of women's exclusion, similar to the case of Omine-san. They've changed the narrative. So now Okinoshima was never off limits to women. It was always off limits to everyone. So you find a shift in the local and therefore the national and global imaginary of that site as well. And while I'm here, I'll just give you a very tiny, simple answer, and we can talk about it much more about what exclusion, what purpose it serves. Exclusion of women specifically, and the imagined and also real practical enforcement of this social taboo against women. So whether it's rejected, as in the Meiji case, or it's embraced, or it's somewhere in between, it always reinforces the nation state of Japan's claims to exceptionalism.
There you go.
Either Japan is unique in that they're leading the way from Asia and stepping into the modern civilized world, or Japan is the nativist who is conserving their tradition. So this is why I'm really intrigued by the issues, or the writings of Yoshioka Hiroshi. It's a very short article from '95 that William Bodiford turned me on to.
I think what you just said, Lindsay, that should go in the back of your book. Like that sentence, that should go.
Okay. Okay, I'll have to remember what that sentence was. But this is this idea of political guiltlessness too. They can do no wrong. So either way they turn, this example, it's not only women's exclusion too. And the idea of Bushido, Oleg Benesh and also William Bodiford had written about something somewhat similar. And in the case of sumo, there are even more intriguing overlaps between how a concept becomes nomadic and it travels. So Bushido was looked down upon, then it's looked favorably upon. Sumo itself was looked upon as barbaric, and then now it embodies the national spirit, and the Yokozuna are gods. So the traveling nomadic nature of certain concepts and practices, I think, is one of the big takeaways from the specific case studies. Maybe Yanis can give a few remarks too before we close up.
Okay. Well, briefly, I think an alternative to the concept of spirituality is a better word. I think I've been playing around with articles, etc., and especially recently with Yoshinaga Shinichi Sensei's research into the Seishin Ryoho and Minkan Ryoho, and so this whole aspects and these practices that were, in a sense, by focusing on new religious groups, were excluded from the study to a large extent recently. There is this non-organizational aspect of therapy and political exchanges between Japanese scholars and intellectuals and theosophies, etc., etc. But before that, I've played around with the concepts of shamanism and how we could use some of those theories to. And Murakami Aki at Komazawa University continues to work with how we can use some of these frameworks to talk about more contemporary similar practices. So I don't think we can get rid of, if you want, the word. The word is here, and but it's quite interesting. What I'm trying to do in the book is how we came about to consider the spirituality as a replacement for other things, and I think that's quite interesting, especially if you look at descriptions of actual therapies that don't change much between the 80s and the 2000s, and that was what I'm more interested in. Right. But fair enough questions. Yes, thank you.
I think we're a little beyond time now, correct? So I want to thank all the panelists and our discussant, our volunteer tech support, everyone who came and listened. A lot of wonderful, delicious food for thought on all accounts and in so many different regards. And I look forward to, in one digital or real space or another, sharing more conversation with all of you. Please be well, take care, and I'm sure we'll see each other on the different platforms here. And then the panelists will reconvene on our other Zoom meeting, okay? Thank you. Bye.